He told Daddy he'd make sure he wins, Lily said, clutching her stuffed bear. The courtroom froze. Judge Holloway's face turned pale as Lily pulled out a recording device. I recorded it. What was on that tape would tear everything apart. But let's start from the beginning. The courtroom was alive with a low hum of anticipation, the air thick with tension. Rows of polished wooden benches were filled with reporters, attorneys, and curious onlookers. Cameras were forbidden in the courtroom, but that hadn't stopped the case from becoming national news. Johnson v. Taylor was more than a custody battle. It was a spectacle. Daniel Taylor was a wealthy and powerful businessman with friends in high places, while Margaret Johnson was a struggling single mother trying to protect her daughter. On paper, Daniel's victory seemed inevitable. He had influence. He had resources. He had power. Margaret had none of that. But what she did have was Lily. And now, all eyes were on the fragile, blonde-haired girl sitting at the back of the room, clutching a small stuffed bear. Margaret sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on her. Her face was pale, the dark circles beneath her eyes betraying months, maybe years, of sleepless nights. Her trembling hands gripped a handkerchief in her lap, knuckles white. She didn't look at Daniel. She couldn't. Daniel Taylor sat with the ease of a man who knew he couldn't lose. His suit was tailored perfectly, his dark hair slicked back with precision. His lawyer, a polished man with steel-gray hair and a shark-like smile, sat beside him, flipping casually through a stack of papers. Daniel's eyes were cold as he watched Margaret, his mouth curling into the faintest suggestion of a smirk. He wasn't worried. He had the system on his side. Presiding over the case was Judge Richard Holloway, a man whose reputation for cold efficiency preceded him. He was in his late 50s. His gray hair combed meticulously to the side, thin glasses balanced on the bridge of his nose. His expression was carved from stone, impassive, detached, as he listened to the arguments from both sides. His rulings were known to be swift and clinical. Justice was a mechanical process to him, stripped of emotion. The case was complex, but the core issue was simple: full custody of Lily Johnson. Margaret had accused Daniel of emotional abuse, of creating a toxic, fearful environment for their daughter. Daniel countered by painting Margaret as mentally unstable and emotionally unfit to raise a child. The outcome seemed inevitable. Daniel had money, and in cases like this, money often meant control. Margaret's lawyer was fighting uphill, and everyone in the room knew it. Lily sat quietly, her feet barely touching the floor, the small stuffed bear clutched tightly in her hands. She was an unusually quiet child, her wide blue eyes filled with nervous energy as they darted around the room. Margaret's lawyer, Mr. Davis, stood and glanced toward Margaret. Then he turned toward the judge. His voice was calm, but there was a hidden edge beneath the surface. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, I'd like to allow Lily to speak." The room stirred. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Holloway's brow furrowed. "Children rarely testify in cases like this," he said, his tone hard. But then Lily stood up. She was small, her frame delicate beneath her simple blue dress. Her hands tightened around the bear's frayed edges as she stepped forward. Her voice was soft but steady. "Please," she said, "I want to say something." Judge Holloway studied her for a long moment. His face was unreadable. "Proceed," he said finally. The bailiff approached and swore her in. Lily climbed into the chair behind the witness stand, her small feet swinging beneath the edge. Mr. Davis approached her carefully, his tone gentle. "Sweetheart," he said, "can you tell us why you want to live with your mom?" Lily's lips trembled, Her small chest rose and fell as she gripped the bear closer to her body. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Because Daddy hurt me. Gasps filled the room. Daniel's expression tightened, his hands forming into fists on the table. Margaret's breath hitched audibly. Her hand flew to her mouth. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened, his back straightening as his eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, Lily?" Mr. Davis's voice was steady, but beneath it was a quiet urgency. Lily's eyes filled with tears. Her hands shook. She tightened her hold on the bear as though drawing strength from it. "Daddy used to hit me when he got mad," she said. "He told me not to tell anyone." Margaret let out a choked sob. Daniel's lawyer was already shifting in his seat, preparing an objection, but Lily wasn't finished. "But that's not why I'm scared," she added, her voice trembling. The room froze. Mr. Davis's gaze darkened. "Why are you scared, Lily?" Lily's eyes lifted toward the judge. For a moment, the room seemed to narrow. The hum of noise and whispers vanished under the weight of what was coming. Her small voice broke the silence. "Because Judge Holloway told him he would make sure Daddy wins." The room exploded. A sharp collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Margaret's head snapped toward the judge. Daniel's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection!" he shouted. "The child is confused." Judge Holloway's face had gone white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked frozen, his hands tightening on the edge of his bench. Lily's eyes didn't waver. "I saw him at Daddy's house," she said. "They were talking. Judge Holloway said he would make sure Mommy didn't win." The shock wave rippled through the room like an earthquake. Margaret's lawyer turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp, "this is a serious accusation. If this is true—" "Enough!" Judge Holloway's voice was sharp and cold. His face was tense, the muscles in his jaw jumping, but Lily wasn't done. Her small hand moved toward the bear's stomach. She pulled at the seam and pulled out a small recording device. "I recorded it," she said softly. Chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions. The judge's gavel slammed down once, twice, but it did nothing to quell the noise. Daniel was already speaking in low, furious tones to his lawyer. Judge Holloway stood, his face red, his hands trembling. "This court is in recess," he barked. Two bailiffs immediately moved toward him. Lily sat perfectly still, her hand still clutching the recording device. Margaret's lawyer's eyes were wide. "We demand this evidence be heard." "It will be." The prosecutor's voice cut through the noise. He stood, his dark eyes locked on Judge Holloway. "And an investigation into this matter is already being initiated." Judge Holloway's face darkened. He stepped down from the bench, his robe billowing behind him as he hurried toward the side exit. Lily's wide eyes watched him leave. Margaret was already moving toward her daughter. She pulled Lily into her arms, clutching her tightly. "You were so brave," she whispered. Lily's small voice was steady as she replied, "I had to tell the truth." Margaret's breath hitched. She pulled Lily closer, shielding her as the noise of the courtroom swirled around them. Justice wasn't served yet, but it was coming. A stunned silence filled the courtroom, the weight of Lily's words pressing down on every person in the room like a vice. The air itself seemed to still, thick and suffocating. Judge Holloway's eyes widened behind his thin glasses. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. His normally sharp, calculating expression had fractured, giving way to something that looked disturbingly close to fear. Daniel's lawyer immediately shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. "Objection!" he barked, his voice sharp and hard. "This is outrageous. The child is confused." Lily's small frame was rigid as she sat on the witness stand. Her blonde curls framed her face, her pale cheeks flushed with color, but her eyes, large, wide, and impossibly steady, locked directly onto Judge Holloway's. There was no hesitation, no confusion. "No," Lily said. Her voice was stronger now, clearer. "I heard them talking." A ripple of sound passed through the gallery. Gasps, whispers, the frantic scribbling of reporters' pens. The reporters in the gallery leaned forward in their seats, their eyes bright with predatory excitement. This was no longer just a custody battle. This was a scandal unraveling in real time. Judge Holloway's hand curled into a fist on the bench. His knuckles whitened. His jaw tightened so hard the muscles in his face visibly jumped. "Lily," the lawyer pressed gently, "what exactly did you hear?" Lily's gaze didn't waver from the judge's. Her small hands tightened around the stuffed bear, her fingers digging into the frayed fabric. "I saw him at my daddy's house," she said softly. Daniel's lawyer paled. Daniel's face tightened, his jaw flexing as his eyes narrowed toward his daughter. Lily didn't blink. "He said he would make sure Mommy didn't win." The room exploded into noise, sharp gasps, hurried murmurs. Daniel's lawyer slammed his hand on the table. "Enough!" Judge Holloway snapped, his voice cracking through the noise like a whip. His face had lost all color, the gray of his hair blending almost seamlessly with the pallor of his skin. But Lily didn't stop. Her gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. "And," she added quietly, "he said he would get a lot of money if Daddy won." The room froze again. The weight of her words slammed into the courtroom like a physical blow. The implication was crystal clear. Bribery, collusion, corruption at the highest level. Margaret's lawyer shot to his feet, his face hard with purpose. "Your Honor, this is a serious accusation." "I said enough!" Judge Holloway's voice thundered through the room, but the underlying tremor betrayed him. His authority was unraveling beneath the weight of Lily's calm, damning words. Daniel's lawyer stood too, his mouth curling into a grimace as he tried to salvage the situation. "The child is clearly being coached." "No one told me to say that," Lily interrupted. Her voice was soft but cutting in its clarity. Judge Holloway's face darkened. His hand gripped the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to control the narrative. But the damage was done. Reporters were already scribbling furiously in their notepads. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she sat frozen, one hand pressed over her mouth. Daniel's face was flushed, not with anger this time, but with the sharp sting of losing control. He adjusted his tie with a jerky motion, his eyes darting toward the judge. His lawyer leaned down toward him, whispering furiously in his ear. Margaret's lawyer's expression sharpened. He turned toward the judge. His voice was cold steel. "We demand an immediate investigation into these allegations." Judge Holloway's head snapped toward him. His nostrils flared. He was cornered, and he knew it. His career, his reputation, his very life, balanced on the edge of Lily's words. "I will not entertain," Holloway began, but his voice faltered under the weight of the eyes on him. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward with rapt attention. The press, the lawyers, the jury, everyone was watching him unravel in real time. The prosecutor stood. His eyes were dark and hard. If these allegations are true, there is more than a custody case at stake here. This is corruption, criminal conspiracy. Judge Holloway's mouth tightened. His eyes darted toward the bailiff, toward the side exit, calculating. "This court," Holloway said through clenched teeth, "will recess until further notice." He stood, his black robe billowing behind him as he turned sharply toward the side door leading to his chambers. But Lily wasn't finished. Her small hand dipped toward the stuffed bear in her lap. Her fingers tugged at the seam beneath its head, a seam that had been carefully stitched shut. And then she pulled out a small black recording device. "I recorded it," she said. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Reporters shot to their feet. Margaret's lawyer's eyes widened in disbelief. Daniel's lawyer's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Daniel himself went white as a sheet. Judge Holloway froze mid-step, his back still to the courtroom. He turned slowly, his face a mask of cold, desperate calculation. Lily held up the recorder, the tiny device trembling in her hand. "I recorded everything," she said. Daniel surged to his feet. "That's illegal," he shouted. She's lying." Lily's gaze didn't leave Judge Holloway's. "You said Mommy wouldn't win," she repeated, "because Daddy paid you." Judge Holloway's face twisted, a vein pulsing at his temple. He opened his mouth, to threaten, to deny, but Margaret's lawyer was already moving. "We demand that recording be submitted into evidence," he said. "Immediately." Holloway's face darkened. "This is highly irregular. It's evidence." Margaret's lawyer cut him off. The prosecutor's voice was sharp. "And if the recording confirms what she says, this case will no longer be about custody. It will be about criminal charges." Holloway's jaw locked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Lily's small hands were trembling as she held the recorder toward her mother's lawyer. "Give it to me," he said softly. Lily hesitated, just for a moment, then carefully handed it over. Judge Holloway's voice was sharp, desperate. "This court is adjourned." He turned, striding toward the exit, but the bailiff was already moving to block his path. The recording device sat in Margaret's lawyer's palm, small, unassuming, but holding the power to upend everything. Daniel's eyes darted toward the judge. His face was tight, his expression calculating. Lily slipped down from the witness stand. Margaret was already moving toward her, pulling her close, brushing her hair back from her forehead. Lily's small shoulders shook. "You were so brave," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lily's small hand tightened around the bear, her chin lifted. "I had to tell the truth," she said. Margaret's breath hitched. She hugged her daughter tightly. Justice wasn't served yet, but it was coming. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like the tide was finally turning. The courtroom was packed to capacity the next day. Every seat was filled, and reporters lined the back wall, their notepads and recorders ready. The air was heavy with tension. Not the usual legal formality, but something sharper, charged, dangerous. The scandal had spread overnight like wildfire. Judge Richard Holloway. Bribery, corruption, conspiracy. The headlines were brutal, and the pressure in the room was palpable. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture tense, her hands clenched together in her lap. Her eyes flicked toward Lily, who sat beside her, small and pale, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. Lily's wide eyes darted nervously across the room, but she didn't speak. Margaret's lawyer, Mr. Davis, stood beside them, his expression hard and focused. His suit was crisp, his gaze sharp, the look of a man ready for war. On the other side of the room, Daniel Taylor sat with his lawyer. His jaw was tight, his dark eyes narrowed dangerously. His lawyer leaned toward him, speaking in low, urgent tones, but Daniel's eyes were fixed on the judge. His hands were clasped together, his knuckles white. Beneath the calm exterior, rage simmered dangerously close to the surface. Judge Holloway sat at the bench, his face impassive, but beneath the desk his hands were shaking. His grip on the gavel was too tight, the muscles in his jaw twitching. He looked composed, but the slight tremor in his hands gave him away. He knew what was coming. He knew what was about to happen. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice rang out. Everyone stood as Judge Holloway entered the courtroom. He settled into his chair, his expression cold and practiced. His gaze scanned the room, lingering briefly on Lily. His eyes narrowed slightly before he straightened. "We'll proceed," he said flatly. His voice was even, controlled. Margaret's lawyer stood. He held the small recording device between his fingers, lifting it slightly for the entire courtroom to see. "With the court's permission," Mr. Davis said smoothly, "we would like to submit this recording into evidence." Judge Holloway's eyes darkened. His mouth twitched at the corners. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that it contains direct evidence of judicial misconduct," Davis replied. Holloway's eyes narrowed. His mouth opened, but before he could speak, Davis walked toward the evidence table. He handed the recording to the bailiff. "We will play it now," Davis said. The bailiff inserted the device into the courtroom's sound system. A sharp click, then silence. The air was so tight that even the sound of someone shifting in their seat felt loud. A crackle of static. Then Judge Holloway's voice filled the room, cold, clinical, unmistakable. "Make sure the money's wired through the offshore account. I'll deliver the ruling in your favor. She won't stand a chance." The room erupted. Gasps, shocked whispers. Reporters scrambled to write down every word, some already texting their editors. Daniel's face twisted, dark, furious. His hand shot toward his lawyer's arm. His lawyer's face was blank, calculating. The whispers intensified, bouncing off the walls and feeding into the thick, oppressive tension in the room. Margaret's hand shot to her mouth. Her eyes widened, disbelief and horror flooding her features. Her shoulders trembled. Lily sat frozen, her wide blue eyes fixed on the floor. Judge Holloway's face drained of color. His mouth parted, but no sound came out. His trembling hand slid beneath the desk, gripping the edge like he was trying to ground himself. His mask of composure slipped. The barest flicker of panic flashed across his face before he caught himself. He swallowed hard. Mr. Davis's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Your Honor," he said coldly, "in light of this overwhelming evidence, we demand an immediate recusal and an independent review of the case." Judge Holloway's head snapped toward him. His eyes sharpened. His hand tightened on the gavel. "You—" Holloway's voice cracked. He coughed, steadied himself. His tone hardened. "You have no proof this is— You were recorded." Davis interrupted. His eyes were like steel. "This is the proof." Holloway's mouth twitched. His eyes darted toward Daniel, who sat rigid, his lips pressed into a hard line. The prosecutor stood from his seat. He was tall, imposing. A man who commanded attention without raising his voice. His dark suit was crisp, his expression calm but deadly focused. His gaze locked on Holloway. "We're filing charges of judicial corruption," the prosecutor said. His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise with precision. "Judge Holloway, you are under investigation for bribery and conspiracy." A sharp intake of breath passed through the room. Holloway's eyes widened in panic. His hand shot toward the gavel, gripping it hard. His knuckles were bloodless beneath the strain. "This is outrageous," Daniel's lawyer shouted. He stood, his face flushed. This is a blatant attempt to manipulate. The prosecutor's gaze slid toward him. Calm. Cold. Sit down. Daniel's lawyer froze. His mouth tightened. Slowly he sank back into his seat. Judge Holloway's breath quickened. He was unraveling, losing control of the room. His legacy, his career, was slipping through his fingers. His chest rose and fell beneath his black robe. His hand shook as he lifted the gavel. "Court is adjourned," Holloway said sharply. His voice was tight, almost frantic. "This court is adjourned." But it was already too late. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 officers in uniform stepped inside. Their dark blue uniforms stood out starkly against the rich wood of the courtroom. The lead officer's gaze locked on the judge. "Richard Holloway," the officer said. His voice was steady. "You're under arrest." Holloway's eyes widened. He sat frozen for a long moment. Then, almost mechanically, he stood. His hands curled at his sides as the officers approached the bench. His face, once so carefully guarded, was an open book now. Panic, humiliation, rage. "This is a mistake," he hissed. His voice was low, sharp. He turned toward the prosecutor. "You can't." The officer stepped forward. "Sir, you need to come with us." Judge Holloway's mouth pressed into a thin line. His chest rose and fell in short, shallow breaths. Slowly, his hands unclenched from the gavel. He took a single step down from the bench. The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The sound of the metal locking into place was deafening in the silence. From across the room, Lily's wide eyes filled with tears. "I was scared," she said softly. Her small voice cut through the tension. Holloway's eyes flicked toward her. His gaze sharpened, cold and cutting, but it lasted only a second before the officer pulled his arms behind his back. "But I knew Mommy needed me," Lily whispered. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she pulled Lily into her side. Lily's small hand tightened on the stuffed bear, her chest rising and falling beneath the weight of it all. Judge Holloway was led toward the exit, his face hard, his steps forced and stiff. The doors swung shut behind them with a loud thud. Reporters were already pushing toward the hallway, shouting questions. Daniel's face was dark, his jaw tight as he leaned toward his lawyer. Margaret's lawyer stood motionless, his eyes locked on the closed doors. Margaret turned toward Lily, brushed her hair back from her face. "You were so brave," Margaret whispered. Lily's chin trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I had to tell the truth," she said. Margaret's breath hitched. She held her daughter close. For the first time in years, she felt the crushing weight of fear begin to lift. Judge Richard Holloway's resignation dominated the news cycle for weeks. His face was splashed across every major network, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, as the scandal unraveled in real time. Headlines screamed of corruption, bribery, and betrayal at the highest levels of the judicial system. Judge Holloway resigns in disgrace after bribery scandal. High-profile custody case exposes corrupt judge. Judge Holloway facing criminal charges for accepting bribes. The once respected judge, known for his cold efficiency and unwavering control in the courtroom, was now reduced to a disgraced figure whose legacy had collapsed in a matter of days. Images of Holloway being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs had gone viral. His carefully constructed reputation, the image of a composed, untouchable legal figure, was shattered. Interviews with former colleagues and legal experts flooded the airwaves. Some claimed they were shocked. Others admitted they'd had suspicions but never dared to challenge a judge with Holloway's influence. The fallout spread quickly. Prosecutors began reopening past cases where Holloway had presided, searching for patterns of misconduct. Several verdicts were overturned, and some cases were brought back to trial. Victims who had been silenced under Holloway's rulings were now stepping forward. Lawsuits were piling up. Holloway's lawyers issued vague statements about misunderstandings and misrepresentation of facts. But the audio recording Lily had provided was ironclad. The damage was permanent. Meanwhile, Daniel Taylor's world was crumbling. He was charged with child abuse and attempted bribery. His high-powered legal team worked around the clock, but the evidence was overwhelming. Lily's testimony, combined with the damning recording of Holloway's voice, had sealed his fate. Daniel's influence, once so formidable, was slipping through his fingers. The trial for child abuse was brutal. Medical records surfaced detailing bruises on Lily's arms and back from years before. Witnesses came forward, former nannies, teachers, and even family friends, describing Daniel's volatile temper and controlling behavior. His own lawyer struggled to keep him composed as Daniel sat through testimony after testimony, his jaw tightening, his face hard with rage. The press feasted on his downfall. Daniel had always used money as a shield, but now money couldn't protect him. The court seized several of his offshore accounts when the bribery charges were filed. His assets were frozen. His business partners began cutting ties. His once loyal friends disappeared. His face, too, became a fixture on the news. Not as a powerful businessman, but as a disgraced figure under criminal investigation. And through it all, Margaret stood quietly at Lily's side. The final ruling in the custody case came swiftly. After everything that had been exposed, Daniel's abuse, Holloway's bribery, the decision was inevitable. Margaret was granted full custody of Lily without hesitation. Daniel was stripped of all parental rights. His visitation requests were denied outright. When the ruling was read aloud, Margaret pulled Lily into her arms. Her hands trembled as she stroked her daughter's hair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I'm so proud of you," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "You were so brave." Lily's small arms tightened around her mother's neck. Her cheek pressed against Margaret's shoulder. She smiled softly, her blue eyes steady. "I knew it was the right thing to do," Lily said. The press wanted interviews, with Margaret, with Lily, with Margaret's lawyer. But Margaret turned them all down. She refused to let Lily become a spectacle. Reporters followed them for weeks, but eventually the media frenzy died down. New scandals and breaking news stories replaced Holloway's disgrace. But for Margaret and Lily, life was finally starting to heal. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret and Lily were walking through a park. The leaves had turned shades of amber and crimson, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly fallen leaves. Lily skipped ahead, her blonde curls bouncing as she laughed. Margaret watched her daughter with quiet relief. Lily's laugh had been rare before, hesitant, cautious. Now it was free, unburdened. A young woman approached them from the walking path. She was in her early 20s, with long brown hair and kind eyes. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me," she said softly. "You don't know me, but I wanted to say thank you." Margaret's brows lifted. "Thank you." The young woman nodded. Her eyes shone with emotion. "My sister lost custody of her child because of Judge Holloway's rulings. Her ex-husband was abusive, but Holloway sided with him because he had money and influence. My sister tried to fight it for years." Margaret's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "But because of you, because of Lily, Holloway's rulings are being investigated. My sister's case is being reopened. She's going to get her daughter back." Margaret's breath hitched. She looked toward Lily, who was watching the conversation quietly, her small hands tucked into the sleeves of her jacket. Lily smiled shyly. "I just told the truth," she said. The young woman's eyes glistened. "The truth was enough," she said softly. Margaret's hand brushed through Lily's hair. The soft curls slid beneath her fingers. "You told the truth, even when it was hard," Margaret said, her voice steady. "That's what makes you brave." Lily's smile widened, her small dimples appearing. She turned toward the path and took Margaret's hand. Her steps were light, her chest no longer weighed down by fear. For the first time in years, Lily's face held peace. Justice had been served, not just for Lily, but for the countless others whose voices had been silenced under Holloway's corrupt rulings. Lily's bravery had set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. Her small act of courage had exposed one of the most powerful men in the legal system and toppled a network of influence that had long seemed untouchable. But for Lily, it wasn't about the headlines or the courtroom victories. It was about standing up for the truth. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand as they walked toward the park's exit. "You hungry?" Margaret asked. Lily nodded. "Ice cream?" Margaret smiled. "Ice cream it is." As they crossed the street, Lily leaned into her mother's side, her head resting against Margaret's arm. Margaret kissed the top of her head. They had walked through fire together and come out the other side stronger. Behind them, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long golden rays through the red and orange leaves. Lily's hand was small in Margaret's, but the connection between them was unbreakable. Justice had been served, because one little girl refused to stay silent.